Seats, we need to begin our work now. Yes, please, take your seats. So we are beginning the work of our roundtable. Its topic is competition state in the agricultural markets. The organizers are the Antimonopoly of Ukraine, Committee of Ukraine, and the Foundation of Development of Competition, CDF. And before I give the floor to our key speakers, and I will introduce them first, if you allow. I would like to say a couple of words as for this event, why it's taking place. As far as you know, the Competition Development Fund, during the recent years, since it's been created, really pays much attention to the state of competition at the social important and strategic markets of Ukraine. The market of agricultural production take a peculiar place in the structure of national economy, and their state really impacts not only the moods of the society, but also the state of the business. It's not weird that for the efficient functioning of those markets, a special place is taken by the state of competition. Beginning with the function, not only the production safety, but national security of the state depends on that. That is why they are under very close attention from all of the branches of power, the whole society, the expert community and business community, some of the participants of today's meeting. In fact, at the cadence of all of the presidents and prime ministers have taken part in the numerous meetings of the National Security Council and other meetings of the government which were dedicated to those markets. But I'd like to drive your attention to the fact that maybe it's never been before the situation when the state of those markets was looked through the prism of competition development, competition protection, maybe only at the meetings of the Antimonopoly Committee of Ukraine, where this topic is always very relevant and important. Maybe you do remember that mostly all of those meetings have been in the framework of the government or in the ground of the president of Ukraine, because there could be certain crises, either sugar or buckwheat or sunflower oil. But still, we understand that without the creation, the system of protection of economic competition in the agrarian complex of Ukraine, there is no point to speak about the reforms of this sector, the overcoming of the unfair practice and monopolism. That is why the Competition Development Fund, together with the Antimonopoly Committee, dedicates our roundtable to this event. According to this table, and it's very important, and we have the live broadcast, because you know that today's roundtable can be seen in any parts of our planet. According to the results of this roundtable, we are planning to adopt a resolution where we'll express our recommendations according to the discussion, your opinions, taking into account your opinions, the recommendations for the local and state authorities, the civil organizations which deal with the competition development at the agrarian markets, and, of course, the business community. And the problems of our agrarian industrial complex, the co-founder of the Interfraction MP, Leonid Kozachenko, has always worried about those issues. I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Kozachenko. You know the regulations, not more than 15 minutes for the key speakers, so please. Thank you sincerely for such an opportunity to speak today at our event. I consider that the issue we are discussing is rather important for our country, which now has a very complicated state at the stage of its development, both in the economy and in the politics, the political system. The issue of competition is one of the key issues. which influences the state of the development of economy, which influences the dynamics of the business development in certain branches. Today we'll focus upon the agrarian sector, which is one of the most active ones and which also can keep our economy from decreasing. And of course we've got different other branches of economy. This is a separate issue which deserves for separate discussions, but today we'll focus upon the agriculture. So why that? Because, as I said, it's one of the main and powerful stabilizers of the state of economy, and also it gives us lots of opportunities for our state to identify ourselves in the global space, because the agriculture is a very serious leader of our impact into the sphere of geopolitics. Today, the products, the food is the most serious weapon. I'm using this word rather often, the weapon. What's more scary, the machine gun, the rifle, or maybe even the nuclear bomb, or still the food? If we don't have any food, we don't have any perspective to survive on this planet. And in the regions of the world where the food supply stops, there are enormous problems emerging. Unfortunately, today in the country, 30,000 of people are dying because of starvation, because of hunger. During the last 15 years, this figure is twice as big. That is why the food will become a very strong leverage, which will influence the external policy, and of course it will influence the development of our country, which has huge opportunities. We can increase the production of agrarian products 3 times. There are no countries on earth who can do it like us. So what interferes us in this way? We'll speak today about competition. Do we have monopoly now? Well, I'd say the following. The experts consider that yes, we have it. In such segments as production of meat, production of sunflower oil, production of sugar. And also I'm worried by a very relevant issue of the land market. Because if we don't conduct certain measures and adopt certain decisions at the legislation level, we can create, unfortunately, monopolies at the market for land. And the period when we are coming closer to the moment when we start the whole land market opening, we need to take into account everything which is necessary not to create these monopolies. There is a very serious common directions which develop, also influence the development of agrarian sector. Unfortunately, the agrarian sector cannot exist without the funding as any other sector. Today, the banking sector of Ukraine has a monopoly which is more than 80% at the market. I mean the banking sector, because officially they say that approximately 69% is the state banks. But we have the treasury, which is also in fact a bank which opens and closes accounts and serves it. If we add the treasury, I apologize, more than 80% of such monopolies are in the banking sector. Maybe it does not happen only in the countries which do not have the market economy, and influences badly, of course. There are lots of issues connected with logistics. Logistics is the monopoly of Ukrainian railways, the monopoly of... There is such a state company, how does it named? The Agency on the Ports Management, the administration of seaports. They are also a monopolist, and if we look at how many private and how many state-owned ports we have and terminals we have, undoubtedly the share of the state is crazy. I don't want to scare you with those figures, because I am speaking about the banking sector, the logistics, but still, in the developed countries, the countries with the market economy, they don't have such crazy monopolies. And also we have a problematic issue with the agrarian sector in the structure of expenses. It has more than 25% connected with energy. Such like electrical energy, we have regional monopolies, regional concentrations. the state has certain subjects which hold this monopoly of energy supply. Just look, what are we producing the energy of? One of the sources is gas. I don't want to name the figures, you just won't believe me. Who is the biggest producer of gas? And when at the council, with the participants of the first Prime Minister, I asked the head of Naftogaz of Ukraine, why do we block the license issue for the private companies to increase the gas? He says, because there will be unhealthy competition. They will achieve the decrease of 20%, and in 3 years there can be a decrease on 40%, and we need to take back the stolen. We need to take back 200 billion of stolen money. So if the private company are coming and are doing that, unfortunately we won't be able to do that. But why don't you take it? Because we know who stole. But if you don't know who stole, you shouldn't speak about that. But still, anytime, there shouldn't be such a monopoly. We shouldn't strengthen it. I don't want to speak about coal, because there is an additional issue about that. 2 state companies. One went bankruptcy, the second then, and now they created the third one. Let us not privatize it, because again there will be unhealthy competition. And again for $3 billion, because the previous $3 billion have been stolen. I don't want to dwell upon that in more details. There are huge problems. So what's this common branch of monopolization? What does it give to the agriculture? At least 30% of losses of competitive capacity. So all of that is very hard issue which needs to be considered and solved. It's a pity that at our today's event we don't have all the people we wanted to have, but we have the key person, the head of the Antimonopoly Committee, and also the representatives of the foreign institutions, which are present at the market of competition in the sphere of business environment and have huge experience in that. The control of the certain legislation, the formation of this legislation. That is nice, but it's not enough, because we should have government members, more of my colleagues and MPs here, because we have huge gaps both in the legislation and in the system of our executive state power. That is why we need to work more on that. We need to study the experience of the developed countries which have market economy and which were able to accomplish a lot. To have real competition, not to have monopolies, and for business to do the best it can and to use it in an efficient way. So let us today discuss all of that. And of course, the decisions and suggestions we'll adopt today on my behalf, I'll try to bring to our authorities, the head of our state. I hope that it will be published in the media and it will help us to move on quicker, in a more rapid way, and to get better results. Thank you. Thank you, Leonid Petrovich, and it was very important, the position of Leonid Petrovich, because he is an MP, he's the head of the Interfraction MP Union of the Protection of Economic Competition, which deals with the same tasks and issues we've mentioned and which we consider today. Thank you. And before I give the floor to Mr. Terentyev, who will present the position as for the review of the key agricultural markets through the prism of competition state and the last tendencies in the economic concentration sphere, I'd like to say a couple of words. That, as you remember, since 2001 we have the law on the protection of economic competition, and the society, the state, have got a unique tool as for the monopolization of the markets. At the head of this process was the Antimonopoly Committee. So it gave us an opportunity to implement non-admission of monopolization. You know that Antimonopoly Committee does not give a permit for concentration if it can lead to monopolization or certain restrictions of competition at the goods market, and only the Cabinet of Ministers, under certain conditions, if the advantages are bigger than the harm for social interests, the Cabinet of Ministers can give certain permits for economic concentrations according to certain procedures. And very often the Anti-Monopoly Committee is considered to be a kind of penitentiary institution, which issues fines, but I would say that its activities is much more full of sense, it's more serious and deeper. This is a serious tool of competitive policy of the state. The Anti-Monopoly Committee takes part in the formation and execution of the principles of competitive policy, thanks to its influence through the offers of the government, through the law drafts, which it gives for consideration. As a participants of this process, for the Cabinet of Ministers, a subject of the legislation initiative, we know that there was a regulated situation at lots of markets of agricultural products. So the role of Anti-Monopoly Committee only increases. So when we have the implementation of the laws on public procurement, on the state help and support, in spite of the certain exemptions, the role of Anti-Monopoly Committee has substantially increased. For 3 years, the new anti-monopoly team, with the head of Yuriy Terentyev, leads this team. Alexander Ivanovich, thank you so much. Hello everyone, to all of the participants of this round table. And again, I'd like to express my gratitude to the Competition Development Foundation for the organization of this event and for all the efforts you're doing for the popularization of this idea of the competition protection and the fight with anti-competition practices. What was mentioned in the beginning of this round table by Mr. Alexander Ivanovich about the importance of the markets connected with the agricultural complex and agricultural products, and the importance of implementation and formulation of the proper industrial and economic policies in those spheres. And then what was mentioned by Mr. Kozachenko as for the main problematics which he as an MP can see in the agricultural sector. In fact, I can approve the understanding of these problematics at the macro level and micro level. It coincides with our vision, because we, as an institution which has a main aim, on the one hand, as it was mentioned by Alexander Ivanovich, our canonic aim is the investigation of the violations of law, but to investigate it, well, it's better to prevent it, not to investigate. Through the creation of the systems, of the preliminary finding and search for negative tendencies, through the high efficient understanding of the markets and the qualitative use of those restricted resources we have, as the Anti-Monopoly Committee is not the Ministry of Good, so we cannot replace all the institutions. The Anti-Monopoly Committee has only 750 employees. We have a limited budget. That is why, solving the issues of the certain branches, we need to focus upon the most important ones. Let me not take your time and to tell you the things which you know from the media, which are secondary, I would say. I will speak about the information which is the product of the Anti-Monopoly Committee. We see what's going on at the markets, we see the announcements we can hear, we see the applications of the MPs. We can see the certain low level of satisfaction which is not expressed officially for us to work properly. This is the lack of satisfaction with business associations because of certain negative phenomena in the agricultural sector. So summing up all of this picture, we can make certain conclusions. What can we say? We can say that the tendency of the development of the agricultural industrial complex, the markets as the notion of a professional, economic and judicial notion, the market of the goods, the place where we have the turnover of the certain type of goods in the certain limits, geographical ones, time limits and others. And we have certain obstacles to have access to these markets. There are certain restrictions as for the activities of the subjects in those markets. Now we can see the following. There are certain symptoms or signs that the agricultural industrial markets are becoming interesting for the investors from the economic point of view. And in fact, there are symptoms of the intensification of competition, because mostly the competition, one of the indirect symptoms of the intensification is the involvement of the investments, the innovations, the differentiation of the products, the vertical integration, the intensification of the M&A transactions. We begin to see it. When we conduct our activities according to our main tasks, that is the control of the concentration and the issues connected with the violations of the legislation on the competition, we can see that those positive tendencies which tell us that the competition intensifies, they can be found, they exist. So, during the first quarter of 2017, we can see the increase of investments. But what was said by Mr. Kozachenko, that the access to the external funding for the subjects of agrarian sector is rather limited, because the vast majority of those investments which come to the agrarian sector are coming at the expense of your own funds for the reinvestments, at the expense of your own resources of the main groups. But we can see that the investment companies begin to express interest to the agrarian assets, and they begin either to procure them or to be co-investors in certain groups. So we can see, out of the concentrations we are working with, that the Ukrainian agrarian holdings are moving along the way of optimization of expenses and implementation of new technologies. And also we can see the signs from the point of view of the range of the goods which is being produced. We have the transition from commodities, the basic goods positions, to the goods with increased value added. And of course here a substantial role is played by the wish of the Ukrainian business to get additional funding, because if you don't have the transparent corporate structure, you can't get funding. You can't get either private investments or external loans. So we can see certain attempts of the Ukrainian agrarian sector to move along the direction of the creation of the more comprehensible, transparent system of corporate relationship in their holdings. So, all of that influences the number, the intensity of cooperation of Ukrainian subjects which work in the agrarian sector with an anti-monopoly committee. During the first half of the year of 2017, up till the current moment, we've considered 252 applications on economic concentration, and 18% of them, that is 45 applications, concern the sector of agricultural industrial complex. Last year, 2017, the overall number of the applications as for the agrarian markets was approximately 150 out of 650 approximately. So in fact we can say that the market, the agro market, is a locomotive, a driver of M&A market. This is the market where we have the biggest number of transactions and which is the most attractive from the point of view of investments. And also, out of the concentrations we see that mostly the transactions which we can see in our work, and it is connected with the legislation conditions of the thresholds, they are done in the formed groups. So one group is buying assets from another group. And what was already mentioned today, that the majority of concentrations to this or that extent concern the increase or optimization of the land bank of the group, when there are enterprises which work growing certain cultures, the grains or any other technical ones, and acquisition of agro-assets aims not to acquire certain property complexes connected with the agrarian production, but the rights as for the land shares. If I am not mistaken, the biggest transaction took place about 1.5 years ago, Colonel Greencore, but we can see that at least during 2017 and the first half of 2018, a very big number of concentrations is taking place in the companies as for the medium level, when the land bank of 20 to 30,000 hectares, and they implement optimization of their land bank in the regions, or expanding or increasing of their land bank according to the production or preserving capacities, or optimization with any other aim. And also we can see that the participants create the vertical integrated structures. We can see also the interest from the institutional investors for Ukrainian agrarian assets. For instance, this year there was a transaction of Dragon Capital, the group that is the Turkey-made production, and unfortunately also we can see the tendency that a substantial number of transactions is taking place with the bankrupted assets, when either the assets for the corporate rights which can be resold for the certain financial institutions, or when the transaction is taking place just to reimburse the debt. For instance, at a certain enterprise there is the debt of $10 to $15 million, and the conditions of the restructuring of this debt is the presence of a different investor into this group. So we can see that I can explain it as a wish of a Ukrainian business to get and to form a transparent corporate structure. Why it's needed? Because they want to involve the high-quality investments, both from the private investors and from the financial groups. There are certain tendencies which take place without taking into consideration Ukraine. During 2016 and 17 we looked at the issues as for concentrations of the main world producers of plants protection means. So during 2016-18 there have been formed the huge groups of China National Chemical Corporation, Syngenta and others, where those are the main groups on the production of the plants protection means. As for the structure, the markets where the concentration was the biggest ones which is connected with the growth of the cultures, which can also witness about the real aim of this concentration, which is the land bank development of the certain agrarian industrial groups. And again, we can see the tendency of the formation of the 10, 20 or 30 agrarian industrial holdings who are the main players of this market. We can see that analyzing the concentrations of 2017, a big number of concentrations, that is 21% of concentration applications, were the group of kernel, Volyn Zernoprodukt, and other groups which are mentioned at the slide. So we can see certain groups which are active in the M&A market to acquire other companies or optimize their own agrarian assets. As we are short of time now, we can speak about the activities of the agrarian industrial complex activities. On the one hand about the plants, on the other hand about the... Those are totally different types. I mean, livestock raising, and there are fewer subjects there, they're less concentrated there, and they have the different problematics when the subjects are applying for the Antimonopoly Committee, and the problematics we can see. So when we speak about the problematics which we face as for the markets of agrarian industrial complex, as for the plants, those are land relations, as it was mentioned by Mr. Kozachenko. The market of the land, the turnover of the shares is done under the state, unfortunately is not at the substantial state control. And those tools, this classical view of the competitive institution for concentration, is based on the concentration of goods markets. The land, as it is in the classical understanding, is not the good. The good is the products which is grown on this land as a main resource. So if we look at the mergers of bigger agro holdings, we can see how undoubtedly we can see the concentration of the certain markets and products. It could be the production of the meat products, or for instance, the grain sales. Antimonopoly Committee analyzes from the informational point of view what's going on with the land banks, and each transaction which is done through the Antimonopoly Committee as for the agrarian sector, it compulsory contains the analysis of those relationships. But just to say whether it's good or bad when the company had 20,000 hectares and now it has 30,000 of hectares, how they are located, what's the geographical structure of this land bank, or other issues connected with the aspects of the agrarian production, now we, as an Antimonopoly Committee, we are developing for ourselves, we are looking at that, and we are analyzing the possible anti-competition consequences. So undoubtedly, the land code includes certain restrictions. This market is not legalized And undoubtedly, the creation of certain transparent tools of controls of land relationship is the certain and very important need. Another issue with the land relations is discrimination of certain subjects connected with different rates of the payments for the rent payments for the land. Those issues are mostly much more intensely solved at the level of territorial units, but we have such problems existing. A big block of the problems as for this sector is the issue connected with the transport and logistics, and as the obstacles of the access and certain restrictions. As for the intense functioning and pro-competitive functioning of those markets, and from the point of view of the possible actions from the authorities. As for certain ports, we had statements as for the discrimination rates of the port payments, or lack of transparency in those processes, or non-transparent mechanism of discounts, when one port can have a more privileged conditions which it can offer to the economic entities it's working with, so it can create the consequences for the competition at the correspondent markets, because this is a non-transparent privilege. As for the port payment, has the very direct consequence for the subject. And of course, at the market of the crop farming, which is discussed for 1.5 years, it's connected with we have this point in the agenda. So if you're interested in the deeper analytics as for the concentration according to certain market as for the crop farming, at this slide we gave the certain examples. If there is the certain goods or service, for instance, the seeds of the agricultural cultures in 2017, out of the overall number of applications we had 537, and since 2017 we have 3 more. This market is national or even over-national, and if we can see the main concentrations of this market and the main shares of this analysis of applications which can be seen, those are the different types of agricultural cultures. They can be 10 to 20%. When we speak about the services of elevators, this market is also a very attractive one for M&A transactions. Last year we had 27 applications which to this or that extent concerned the assets connected with the elevators. This year there are 8 of them. This is the local market. The main shares, well, it's less concentrated, only to 10 to 20, from 1 to 10%. As for the issues, as for the livestock raising, it was mentioned that this market is more problematic. Those researches of Antimonopoly Committee which we held and which now are still ongoing witness that we have certain symptoms of oligopolic structure. Does this structure have the symptoms of abuse of the collective anti-monopoly state or the individual monopoly state? This problematics is being researched by the committee. But last year, as for those markets, of course we had fewer applications in comparison with the crop farming. As for the cattle, there were only 5. As for the poultry, we had 3. So to sum up my part, I can come back in my conclusion to the beginning. of what I said in the beginning. We can say that everything which is connected with the agrarian markets, and it's a good tendency, begins to shape into a more comprehensible branch with a more intense competition, with the more understandable players. Those players wish, naturally, they wish to play along the rules, because we can see the signs that they want to do that along the international standards which are acceptable to gain investments and funding. We can see that at least the markets of the basic products, as for the geographical locations, have the national and international limits, which are overnational, I would say. And the main problematics is connected with their functioning. It's connected with the markets which are allied markets or neighboring markets. This is the anti-competitive actions from the authorities, transport and logistics, certain external limitations connected with the funding. This is the non-transparency of the land market. So this is the problematics, in fact, which we had already mentioned in the beginning of our work. Livestock raising is a bit of a different sector, where in fact we can see the higher concentration and more attention of Antimonopoly Committee from the point of view of the possible violations by the participants of the markets, not by the participants of the neighboring or adjoining markets, like in the case of crop farming. So unfortunately, we invited the representatives of the certain ministries to come here at this meeting, which deal with this spheres. The Ministry of Infrastructure and Ministry of Agricultural Industrial Complex, which do the implementation of the policy in the agrarian sector, they didn't join us. We, as an anti-monopoly committee, if we speak what interferes, what's in our way, what's the biggest restriction of our work, the biggest limitation is the lack of the true and relevant information. Because without the high quality, relevant economic, commercial, business information, we cannot respond quickly and take certain decisions in our competency. So undoubtedly, a high-quality, qualitative improvement would be the improvement of cooperation of all of the authorities to solve the problems of functioning of all of the markets of agrarian sector, from the point of view, at least from the point of view of the efficient sharing of information as for the current state. Because the statistics, which can be found in the statistics service, is not that useful for anti-monopoly committee, because the level of aggregation of data is not appropriate for our work. And the accomplishment of each task of anti-monopoly committee needs holding of the new research, basing upon certain market data, the information we can gain from the subjects. Well, of course, subjects are not that glad to do that, because they say, why does the Anti-Monopoly Committee send us the requirements if this information is open and public? Unfortunately, it's not open and public, because the open and public one is not useful for us. And now I think I'll stop. In the second part of this forum, I think Igor Kustovsky will be given floor. He's the director of the Department of Goods Markets, who deals with the markets, and Oksana Dagileva, who deals with market for non-goods, non-product markets, all the finances, logistics and transports, and they will tell about practical implementations as for the problematics. Thank you. Thank you, Yuriy Alexandrovich. And we as participants of the roundtable, we again have an additional proof that in the archives of Antimonopoly Committee we have a unique and sometimes even incredible information which was never touched by the hand of the state wise man who has to sum up this information and to create certain conclusions, to suggest certain law drafts. This is not a reproach for the Antimonopoly Committee. They have to deal with that. But if they did that, they wouldn't do their daily activities. But unfortunately, we don't have the representatives of the state institutions who deal with those product markets we are speaking with, so I will allow myself a short comment which is connected with the two reasons. First of all, that those institutions are just afraid of this topic. Really, they're just afraid. They don't know this topic. Because today in the provisions of the ministries, and this is the separate topic, we'll ask Vladimir Petrovich to help us, to support us in that. We think that in the provisions of the Ministry of the Central Executive Branch, we must have the direct norm that they're responsible for the development of competition in the certain branch. Unfortunately, such norms were polished out of these provisions, and they consider that they don't concern to the competition. There is an anti-monopoly committee. Work with the committee. But that's not right. They are the subjects of the competitive policy of the state. Not only the policy in the narrow profile sphere of a certain department which deals with milk only, or with procurement only, and something like that. In this part, the anti-monopoly committee is deprived of the primary information which should be going from those state institutions. They have to analyze the state of competition at the markets of logistics, or mineral fertilizers, or grain, sunflower oil, milk markets, and to give this information to the committee, to cooperate and even to pray for them, to ask them for them to take part in this sphere. And the committee is ready to do that. But today, they don't have this cooperation, not because they don't want to do that, but those institutions don't want that. I think that in the resolution of the foundation, we need to reflect all those points. And now, using an opportunity, I'd like to present to you the next, our key speaker, who is Mr. Russell Damtoft, the Director on International Issues of the Federal Trade Commission of the United States of America. He's one of the two anti-monopoly This is one of the two anti-monopoly institutions of the United States of America. You know that it has its history since very long ago. So Mr. Russell Damtoft is widely known. He's known anywhere in the world. Today he's responsible in FTC for the cooperation with the anti-monopoly institutions of Canada, Latin America, Ukraine, and lots of other countries. He is the head of the regional units of the technical support of FTC for the development of foreign competitive institutions, and this is he's for 99% reason that the Ukrainian Anti-Monopoly Committee, through the USAID help, got the program of technical support and now successfully uses this program. I know that lots of things which they helped and prompted to the Anti-Monopoly Committee, Yuriy Terentyev and his team are using in their activities every day. Besides that, I'd like to say that Mr. Russell Damtoft for 33 years is working in FTC. He had all the levels of this system, so I'm really happy to give him the floor. Thank you.
Really quite a bit to say and way oversaid, but thank you very much. I would like to talk a little bit about some similarities between the United States and Ukraine when it comes to agriculture. I could not agree more with Mr. Kozachenko about the importance of the sector. So this is some of the things we have in common. I used to live in the state of Iowa, which has, like Ukraine, great soil, lots of land, and huge potential for both agriculture, both domestically and as an export market. Ukraine should be an absolute agricultural powerhouse around the world. And the question which we need to ask ourselves with competition policy is how can we harness those competitive forces so that Ukraine can achieve that potential? Now, competition law and policy have two functions here. In some ways, in the Ukrainian context, I have the order reversed. As in any other country, we have law enforcement cases when you have anti-competitive conduct by dominant firms, which could lead to higher prices. That's higher prices not only for end consumers, but for producers, such as farmers. Conduct that reduces output, or fewer options for farmers or other market participants. But all of that assumes that you have a well-developed market. And perhaps the most important thing is a second, which I have here, which is advocacy by a competition agency to support the development of a competitive market. That means advocating for laws, regulations, and policies which support competition and against those which restrict competition, market access, or innovation. We have those problems in our country and countries around the world, which we'll get to in more detail. And competition agencies should be advocates for the kinds of institutions and processes that make competition work. Now, let me start with the law enforcement part. We have three types of conduct that can prevent markets from functioning: anti-competitive agreements between competitors, conduct by dominant firms that have the effect of excluding competitors, and mergers between competitors. I'll give you a few examples from our experience. One of the early cases, which goes back to the early 1900s, involved 6 meatpacking firms. And they decided to fix prices among themselves for livestock and meat. And if any company dealt with any of its smaller competitors, it refused to buy from them. That had the effect of creating a monopoly in meat. It reduced prices to farmers. It increased prices to consumers. And that was one of our very early competition cases in the sector. A much more recent case was in the state of Nebraska, where there was a market for buying meat from cattle producers and then selling it to meat packers. And these buyers got together and simply agreed on prices, and they kept the prices artificially low. So these kinds of things can happen. Results in lower prices for farmers, higher prices to consumers, the worst of all worlds. Another common problem we have to deal with involves agricultural cooperatives. Now, at the start, I have to say that agricultural cooperatives are a good thing. You have many small farmers that don't, by themselves, have access to markets. They don't have the ability to obtain the quality certifications from buyers. Left by themselves, they're on their own and almost in a subsistence market. They can get together and pool their resources and be able to market themselves collectively. And we have laws that permit them to do that, so long as they stay within the bounds of what the purpose is. The problem is if they go beyond that. We have had cases where cooperatives themselves start acting like dominant firms, and we've had to take some action. I'll give you an example. Involves mushrooms. Let's see. Okay, is this correct? Does that show mushrooms? Okay, that didn't look right. So we had a mushroom cooperative that had 60% of the U.S. market. And the cooperative wanted to have more of the market than that. So they started buying up all of the non-member mushroom farms, and then they would turn around and resell them, but put restrictive covenants in the deed of sale that would prohibit the land from ever being used for mushroom farming again. And you can't grow mushrooms just anywhere. So this had the effect of increasing their market share and starting to become a monopoly. The Department of Justice sued in that case. The activities went beyond the intended beneficial purposes of the co-op, and they got them to actually nullify the deed restrictions. So this was an example of something which is a good thing, but where we have to make sure that it does not go beyond its good purposes. Okay, monopolization is when you have a firm that's dominant that uses anti-competitive practices to exclude firms. And in some jurisdictions, including the EU, dominant firms have special responsibilities once they get there. The case I just described could just as well have been an example of a monopolization case where you have a dominant firm, in this case the co-op, that uses dirty tricks, for lack of a better term, in order to exclude competitors from the market. Then we get into the area of mergers. This is a big part of what we do in the agricultural sector. I'll give you some examples of cases. We had dealt with a merger involving two firms that made pesticides, which are used for clearing fields and are also important in the citrus, tree nut, peanut, and potato farms. And the problem is obvious that if the merger goes through, the price of pesticides is likely to go up, which is going to increase the cost of inputs for farmers. We also had a case where we had the third and fourth largest beef processors, which would have affected competition for the purchase of cattle. We had a merger of chicken processing plants. Now that involves what we would call a monopsony, where it is not a dominant position in the seller of a product, but a dominant position for the buying of the product. And that is likely to give chicken farmers fewer choices as to where they could sell their chickens, and most likely that would result in them getting lower prices. And very recently, two producers of potash, which is also an important fertilizer, which merged. So that's the law enforcement side, but let me turn to what I think in this context is the more important side, which is the competition advocacy part of our work. A competition agency like the FTC or the AMCU may be the only institution in government that has the expertise and the interest to recognize regulatory impediments that reduce competition and prevent a free market from working as well as it did. I'd add that the OECD has a competition assessment toolkit, which has recently been published, which the AMCU has adopted, as well as the FTC, which helps recognize and identify these kinds of anti-competitive barriers. Now, let's talk a little bit about what this means in the case of agriculture. Those of you who are agricultural specialists know much better than I do that if you want to have successful agriculture, it takes a lot of moving parts that are interconnected. You have to have credit to borrow money for seed, for equipment, for land. There need to be financial instruments available. There has to be mechanisms by which a farmer can lock in a price by selling a crop, having a known crop at harvest time, or to transfer the risk to speculators through hedging contracts. They need to be able to buy inputs, fertilizer, water, seed, insurance for crops and for livestock. There needs to be a distribution system that includes multiple buyers. There need to be good roads. There need to be railroads, waterways if it's available, and then possibly, shipping on the Dnipro. It's helpful to have processing facilities so you can have higher value goods. So instead of exporting grain, you can export flour. Export marketing, know-how. One thing, when you have small producers, they may not know how to access businesses and access markets well. And one function is to provide that kind of knowledge and education to them. And then, of course, what every farmer knows, you need sun, you need rain, and you need a good bit of luck. Now, all of these things require regulatory systems and infrastructures to make them work. A land ownership system, so you can acquire land and know that you have good title to it. A collateral system, so you can put up land or crops as collateral against a loan. Nobody's going to loan you money if you don't have a guarantee of repayment. A way to enforce contracts, food and drug safety, futures exchanges, roads, railroad, river, and export marketing mechanisms. And that's just the list that a friend of mine and I came up with. It could be much longer than that. In a country like mine, we tend to take all of that for granted, that all of those institutions are in place. We shouldn't take them for granted, because if any one of them is blocked by a lack of competition, that drives up prices, reduces choices. So that brings us into the question of regulations. And regulations serve many important, legitimate, pro-market purposes. For example, there's agricultural and meat safety requirements. We need those. However, there is always the potential for excessive regulation to be used more to prevent competition than in order to fulfill the legitimate purpose. If those regulations go so far as to lead to monopolies when only one person can qualify to enter a market, reduce incentives for innovation, and maybe the service isn't provided at all. Now, agriculture has been especially subject to this in my country, in Europe, and many others, where farmers and producers will go to their legislators and say, yes, competition is good, but not in my industry. I don't know if you've ever heard anything like this. And therefore, we need special regulations to protect us. And farmers have been especially good in my country at making their voices heard. And we have a lot of those regulations. And they have consequences, many of which are unintended. Some are intended. So legitimate regulatory purposes can pose barriers to markets. They can set up systems where competitors can collude. There can be regulations that discourage formal market participation. If you can't get yourself registered or legally produced, then maybe the only choice is to go underground and not be registered, be in the informal economy, and loss of the benefits of competition. Competition authorities can advocate for better practices by showing regulators how to achieve their regulatory goals, while at the same time letting competition work its magic and for the free market to flourish. Let me give you a couple of examples. One is milk. The state of New York had a law which licensed milk distributors and would let the state deny a license if the result would result in destructive competition in a market that was already served, or demoralization of price structure, whatever that means. And that insulated the existing distributors from competitors, especially from the state of New Jersey, which is just across the river. We documented that this raised the cost of milk to 30 cents per gallon and argued for removing the restrictions. Marketing orders is something which we have in our country. It lets the Agriculture Department enter orders to prevent market failures which result in overproduction or undersupply. And they produced an order which required farmers of hops to restrict their output. Now, hops is something which is a necessary ingredient in the production of beer. And the Department of Justice successfully argued that these restrictions would distort competition and protect the markets from responding from demand. Another example in the cases of chicken farming. Now, generally in the chicken raising industry in the US, the chicken farmers don't actually own the chickens. They only raise them. They buy the eggs, and then they hatch, and then they raise them and fatten them up and then send them to market. So there was a regulatory proposal which would have required all farmers to be paid equally by the number of chickens they're raising, not how much they weigh, not how many actually make it to market in an edible form, and that would have destroyed the incentives to raise better chickens. And that proposal would have destroyed any incentives for farmers to be more efficient, and we argued against that. So you get the idea. I'm going to skip over to one last one, which is railroads. Railroads in the U.S. were regulated until the 1970s. They couldn't abandon routes. They had to charge fixed prices no matter what. Every rate change had to be approved by the government, even though there had been the rise of roads and trucking. The effect was the railroads were not able to compete with lower rates. They didn't attract the investment which was needed to buy the needed wagons and engines to get products to market, and it became a dying industry even though it was essential. The Justice Department argued that regulation didn't serve any useful purpose and had prevented the railroads from responding to demand. In fact, in response, the railroads were deregulated, prices fell, service improved, and the railroad is now a dynamic sector that is very good at moving products to market. So, a comprehensive agricultural market needs a cohesive and coordinated set of laws, policies, and institutions. Competition policy and agricultural policy can and should inform each other about how competition can help agriculture meet its potential in Ukraine. Thank you.
Дякую, пан Damtoft. Дуже цікава презентація. Я думаю, що всі ми можемо скористатися цією інформацією завдяки тому, що ви зможете на сайті Фонду розвитку конкуренції завжди ще раз передивитися цей матеріал. І наступна тема присвячена у нас визначенню меж ринків як основі ефективної конкуренції.
The limits and borders of the markets as a foundation for the efficient, competitive legislation work. I'd like to say a couple of words about the importance of the competitive and antimonopoly sphere. And the courts know that, but not all of the state officials know about this problematic. Still, any research of the market begins on the precise definition of market. How important it is, I can mention out of my experience according to several examples. For instance, once, at the meeting of the government, we almost had a mistake when we had a so-called bread crisis. And the government said about the grain market state, but we should speak about the grain market for export, and we had totally different participants and players in this market. So thanks to the positions of the Anti-Monopoly Committee, this mistake was not done. A different situation when at the sunflower oil market, the players did not define the proper place at this market, and they did not use the rules of competition. So their judicial services gave them, unfortunately, inappropriate advice. So they were abusing the dominating state, and they had the very substantial fines, several of millions of hryvnias. And for the recommendation of the Antimonopoly Committee, the sunflower oil market had to correct this situation. So during lots of years, there were no reasons to speak about the abuse and violation of rules at this oligopolic market. And one more case, when the Ministry of Agricultural Industrial Complex had a decree and defined that at the market of fumigation there can be one certain subject of economic activities, so it monopolized it. As the result, those sections were considered to be anti-competitive. This decree, of course, was cancelled, and later on this issue was considered at the meeting of the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine. So that is why the definition of the efficient competitive use of such limits is very important. So I have an honor to give the floor to the head of the board of the Competition Development Foundation. That's his idea to create this foundation, and since 2008 he is a partner and a friend of Antimonopoly Committee, because it was his idea to implement and to invent the International Competition Forum. We held it this year, it was the 7th already, and he has invented lots of things like that in the sphere of anti-competition policy. Sergiy Tsivkach. Thank you, good afternoon. When we were getting ready to get this event, we were thinking which presentation we should prepare. As this is the first event, and we are planning lots of events as for the agriculture and common markets, we decided to focus upon the definition of limits of the markets. I can see here both lawyers and representatives of business, the representatives of business associations. So this presentation may be very basic, a bit trivial for the lawyers and Antimonopoly Committee representatives, but still we tried to make it interesting both for the business and the professionals in the sphere of competition law. In the competition law, the definition of market is one of the most important analytical tools which is used with an aim to assess the concentration of the market and market power of the economic entities, certain restrictions, possible restrictions in the competition, the influence of the market behavior of the company onto the competition, and other components of an efficient competition process. As for the complicatedness of the process of the definition of the market, the world recommendations witness about the necessity to define not only parts of the market at the economic entities, but their behavioral characteristics. For instance, when we speak about the cases about the concentration, it's necessary to pay attention to the price tendencies. I mean, the increase or the decrease or the opportunity to influence such a price behavior in the future after the concentration. As for the abuse of monopoly state, we need to pay attention to the direct effect of those companies acting onto the competition. The requirements of the legislation, both in Ukraine and in EU, they witness that when we look at the concentration and when we investigate the cases of anti-monopoly activities, we need to define the limits of the relevant markets. So you can see the links onto those legislation acts in the presentation. When we speak about the relevant or correspondent markets, we mean the unification of two types of markets. This is the combination of the commodities and geographical market. The first one is the market where the goods and services can be replaceable from the point of view of the consumer, according to the following reasons, like the characteristics of the goods, the price of the goods, the direction of the use of this type of the goods. If we speak about the geographical market, we are speaking about the territory, the area where the competing companies are working, and this territory has approximately equal competitive environment. So you can see an example of the commodities limits of the market. If we speak about the grains, this is the biggest circle, then in it we have corn or wheat, which takes its own place, and the flour can be both corn flour and wheat flour. it takes the biggest part. So this is how we should visualize and find the goods limits of the market. If we speak about the geographical limits, this is of course the whole world, then the country, the region and the city. And there can be other regional territories. The relevant or the correspondent market is the one which is defined by the test of SSNIP. This is a very important formula which is called small but significant and non-transitory increase in price. In Ukrainian it is, well, and he translated into Ukrainian. And during such a test we have an increase of the price of the goods, not substantially, up to 5 to 10%. But if the competitive agency which researches this type of market sees that the potential sellers, consumers can replace this market, it means that this market is wider and broader. This is a widely known formula like that. To investigate the market, we need to begin to narrow down the definition, and using this test SSNIP, we should increase it to get the positive result. In this case, the positive result is the consent of the customers for the higher price. SSNIP is used together with the critical loss analysis. Here we have two issues. What is critical loss? Which loss can be allowed by the monopolist to increase the price not significantly, and when his actions will become economically not profitable. When we see that when the real losses are lower than the critical losses, the market will be narrower. In the opposite situation, we can see the symptoms that the market is wider. You can see at this scheme 3 rectangles, and please look at the green one and at the red one. If the green rectangle is bigger than the red one, this is the increase on SSNIP for 5%, and the red one are the consumers who decided not to cooperate with this supply because there was an increase of the price. So if the green rectangle is bigger than the red one, it means that the market is too narrow. But if the green rectangle is smaller than the red one, it can mean the increase of the price, and it's not profitable, so the market is wider. SSNIP and CLA are used to define the position of only the certain number of clients, not all of them. We don't have to conduct the research and to ask each buyer of these products whether he will replace this product or not. Those tests only show us an opportunity to have a transition into the replaceable goods or service of such number of clients which will make the increase of the price unprofitable. SSNIP can be used only under the conditions of the competitive market. This is the case of the 50s, which was researched by the American institutions, the company DuPont, when they were trying to use SSNIP test, but the price was already monopolistic. And in such case, it was already not possible to use this test in an efficient way when we have already the fixed monopoly prices, because the buyers can buy the replaced products, which they would never choose under the conditions of the competitive market. The relevant markets are not fixed. We can see several subjects, economic entities, 6 of them, and we can see that for the subject A, the relevant market could be with the subjects B, C, E, and DEF. And for the C, the relevant market could be with the subjects A, C, D, and E. We should pay attention to that too. Additional information as for that, we should pay attention that it is impossible to use monopoly power in the situations when the buyers can easily find and buy the replaceable. And also the potential competitors can increase the production capacities or have access to the relevant market, then the market power does not exist in such case. The markets with the products are of multilateral use. This is very important for the agricultural markets. On the case of the newspapers, I can say that the newspapers can be used to sell advertisement and to sell the newspapers themselves. For instance, web platforms, they can be used both simultaneously for the buyers and for the sellers. And as for the agricultural products, we have the same multi-aimed use. The products can be used by different sellers for different use. The process of the definition of the commodity market is a highly structured approach to assess the opportunities on the replacement of the products. And here we need the totally nicely done analysis, especially in the part of the research of the market, because the complicatedness of the competition relationship between different products may not be reflected, because the definition of the market is important when you assess the competitive environment. The limits of the market can be soft. According to the market share of the company, they may not be that substantial. It's really important to have the proper economic analysis and to use it according to the best world practice. And also, we shouldn't begin the analysis of the effect of market behavior in the beginning. It may lead to the wrong result. Alternative methods which can define the market limits. Those can be price indicators. If the different products belong to one goods market, their price should be changed in the same way, but we still to pay attention to the national inflation, the growth of the population, seasonality and other factors which can influence the deviations of the price. And you can see different cases of A and B where the deviations of the price are different, but it's possible that it will be one relevant market. The analysis of the shocking events is a very important thesis too. This is the analysis of the past events at the market which did not concern competition, but still they came from the outside and could influence the limits of the markets. That could be internal ones too. For instance, that can be the appearance of the new products or the company at the markets, advertisement campaigns, tax reforms, the change of the rate of the national currency, strikes, the increase of the price of the components of production, and other factors I will mention later. What conclusions can be done out of this short presentation? First of all, the definition of the market is a very complicated process. That is why the law enforcement and experts understand that this is the OECD approach, and sometimes the results can be under doubts, especially in the cases which assess the availability or the lack of the market power of economic entities. The stable practice of the definition of the market leads to the lower definition of the competitive process, but the use of the new mechanisms can lead to the more precise result. Simultaneously, it may decrease the lower definition. So we need to find a very accurate balance for us not to have any break of the limits. And when we define the limits of the goods markets, we need to use the best international experience and practices, OECD, ICN, the bad court practice, and others. We should base upon the conclusions of the experts in this branch, and we should have the principle of public awareness when we take those conclusions. And now I'd like to come back to the shocking events I've mentioned, because during the recent years Ukraine and the agrarian industrial complex markets are under the influence of the national, regional, world politico-economic tendencies. We can speak about the key reforms of Ukraine which are not over yet, the additional orientation of the trade economic policy, and some of the restriction measures in the international trade of other countries which can influence the strategic markets of Ukraine. So when we define goods markets of this complex, which are the strategic branch in Ukraine and have international context, it's necessary, it's very important to analyze those issues and to take into consideration the consequences of such changes. And here, during the analysis of the markets and definition of its limits, we should remember the key thing, that the key aim of the definition of market is finding the mutual replacement of the goods or services, which allows us to define the goods and geographical limits of the certain market. This is what the Business and Anti-Monopoly Committee should pay attention to. And what's the relevant market? This is the end conclusion. This is the smallest amount of products when the monopolist can, or hypothetical monopolist can, use his market power, B, to get profits, C, to restrict production, and D, increasing the prices up to the monopoly level. Those four elements tell us that we have the definition of the relevant market, and we can have the law enforcement practice on that. So, the decision of the Anti-Monopoly Committee in the sphere of law and the decisions of the business when they develop business strategies should base upon the precise definition of the limits of the relevant goods market. Thank you for your attention, and again I'd like to thank Anti-Monopoly Committee that you are using the new practices, but we shouldn't stop. Ukraine is an agrarian country. This is our strategic branch, so in fact I do hope that during the year and a half, we will be able to develop the new concepts and even to give recommendations to such international organizations as OECD how to use the definition of limits of goods markets, especially at the markets of agricultural products. Thank you for the floor. Thank you, Mr. Tsivkach, and I'd like to add two more points. That first of all, there is the court practice which defines that the authorities to define the limits of goods markets is the Anti-Monopoly Committee's privilege. This is the proper thing and it's obvious. So the court practice told us about that. And the second point, that in fact, out of the report of Sergiy Tsivkach we could hear that to define is a little thesis in the university, right? Because this is the topic for the expert environment, both of the Anti-Monopoly Committee, because we have such an expert community in Ukraine. It can base upon this opinion of the experts to take their decision substantially. We do understand that you've got lots of work to do, but still there are people who know how to do that. Thank you for your attention. And now we're coming to the last speech of the first session. I totally consciously didn't give you an opportunity to ask questions because, well, of course, both Mr. Kozachenko and Terentyev are very busy and they will leave us after the first session. So after the last speech, you will have an opportunity to ask the questions to the participants of the first panel. So now I give the floor to Mr. Vladyslav Karpenko, who is an expert on the development of business in the rural areas of USAID project, the support of agrarian and village development. Please. Thank you, dear colleagues. Thank you so much, Alexander Ivanovich, for the floor. I'll try to be really short and to present my thesis, because we are now almost in the end, so to give more time for Q&A session, I'd like to come back to the point which was mentioned by Mr. Russell, that in fact the potential of the development of the production of the households and agrarian households has a very huge potential. And we are saying that we're speaking about the market of agriculture, agrarian one. We are speaking about the level of competition and the use of different approaches for their analysis of this competition. But if we speak about such market as vegetables, fruits, milk, meat of cattle or meat of pigs, for instance, this market can be named chaotic. It's very difficult to analyze it, moreover to research it, because mostly this market is represented by the smaller households. As a result, as for the milk market, this is 60 to 70% of production. For some products, this is 97% as for potatoes. So it's very complicated to speak about the level of analysis of competition, but we can speak about the ways how we can help those smaller households to cooperate with the networks and to be at the civilized market. Why is it that complicated? It's so hard to the households to have access to the civilized market. First of all, because of the quality of the products. It's totally diverse. Someone uses one technology, the others the different. The diversity and unification of those products, different sorts, different kinds and volumes, and also the formation of the trade parties and shares. Today, Mr. Russell has mentioned about the experience of the US. So we can name lots of examples of cooperation of other countries. The development of cooperatives. In Europe they are presented nicely, in Japan, in Asian countries, and so on. So I'd like to say a couple of words today in my presentation about the role of the agricultural cooperatives in the agrarian sphere and how they can present these products at the civilized, as we say, markets. First of all, I'd like to say that, in fact, the development of the cooperation in Ukraine is a very young case in Ukraine. A young one, and it takes approximately not more than 1% in an overall price of the agricultural production bulk. So to speak about the competition market is not the right thing to do. If we speak about the US experience, it's more than 40%. But if we speak about Europe, in some cases it's up to 80%. Asian countries up to 90%. That is why we have the place to improve. We've got a room for improvement. And I'd like to have this short presentation as a bridge between the first and the second session and the cooperatives, between the smaller and medium producers and the market of consumers. So I'd like to say about three tendencies which can help the producers through the cooperatives to achieve markets. This is the formation of the parties of the products to sell and to provide quality, the local processing and certification, which is very relevant in our opinion. I'll give you certain cases of such cooperatives, not only to show them, but for us to try to disseminate this information, because those are first cases and we should try to support them. The formation of the parties of the products. First of all, we've got lots of milk cooperatives. This is the formation of vegetables and fruits and berries, the cold logistics, and so on. The cooperative of Rivne region produces and sells to the markets the different types of feedstuff or feed compounds. We have rather relevant cases. The cold logistics is done by the vegetables and fruits vegetables production, berries. You could see the case of the cooperative which had watermelons and melons supplied through the markets, and this is the case of the Shvar market in Lviv, and then exports it to the Baltic countries and to Poland. You can see that in fact all of those products and goods, the majority of them, is produced and formed by the usual people, usual villagers, who are working on the ground. And it's very complicated for them to compete with the bigger agrarian business. The same can be told about the local processing. When they form the little cooperative enterprises, in the majority this is the milk production and milk processing. The very big sector which is still not used but has a huge potential is the medicine plants, and we like ecological products. So potatoes, cheeses, local products which are presented by the regional brands and so on. Honey. And what I'd like to drive your attention to, the certification for today. The small producers won't be able to have access to the markets, especially European ones, international ones, as for the fruits and vegetables, without the certain certification. So the opportunity to merge them into cooperatives and to have group certification, I mean Global Gap, BRC and others, is the opportunity which will give this competitive advantage as for in the comparison of other producers. The same concerns the certification. For today, Ukraine has the European project working, which promotes the legislation and the opportunity to certify the regional, I mean local ones. This is the same like in Europe, PGI and PGO. So, to sum it up quickly, the cooperative for today in Ukraine unfortunately do not play the role which they should play, which is played by the cooperatives in different countries, but they have the huge potential for their development. And we, as an expert environment and as experts, we need to understand that this potential needs to be supported both informationally, legislation way, and it is done, a huge work is done. Mr. Mikhailo is sitting here, he can tell us more about that today the Parliament of Ukraine has the law draft about the agricultural work to improve it, and also the good producers themselves. Thank you for such an interesting and full of sense presentation. I'd like you, the participants of this round table, as we are finishing the first session, you can ask the questions to the participants. First of all to Mr. Terentyev, because he will have to leave soon. Then Mr. Russell, of course, Mr. Tsivkach, please. Are there any questions? I've got the question to Mr. Terentyev. Would you please tell us, you're speaking about certain solutions, how quickly will you implement them, and how quickly can you do that? Or maybe you should have to say that this period of time can be prolonged and pushed back. Thank you. Well, thank you for the question. This is a painful point, honestly speaking, for everything which is connected with the activities of the committee. When I presented those basic directions of our work, they can be divided into three parts. The first part concerns our work as for the permits for the economic concentration. The permits for economic concentration should be given because we are interested for the subjects to apply for us, to show the proper corporate structures, proper owners. So we create the measures to show the concentrations which are not allowed. Mostly this block of work is professionally intense. The lawyers which deal with these problematics, historically they were rather limited. Now there are more of them, but mostly this is the big business which now understands that to the certain extent it depends on the Antimonopoly Committee, because those games that were played during the 90s, they are coming back, they are echoing in the big groups. When they can't get the permit to pay interest or to have transactions abroad, as for their external economic contracts, because the financial control authorities block them because of the lack of transparency of the corporate structure, of the issues connected with the owners. That is why, really, I agreed that during this first block we have the understanding of the necessity of legislation, and I am satisfied altogether with the trend which I can see. The next two blocks are connected with the response of the state power authorities onto different actions of Antimonopoly Committee as for the advocacy of competition, when we can see the certain abuse of power. As for this violation or certain problematics, we don't open the case, but we write a letter with certain initiatives to the certain ministry, and we develop the constructive algorithm to solve the issue. Unfortunately, for the moment when I came to the Anti-Monopoly Committee, honestly speaking, the quality of this institutional cooperation was at a very low level. Maybe it happened because simultaneously we had the whole reboot of lots of ministries and institutions, and the working relationships we had with our colleagues, the Ministry of Economy, the Ministry of Infrastructure, of Agricultural Industrial Complex, were broken. So for a long time we had to restore those connections. Now I can state that in comparison with the situation we had 3 years ago, this is a totally different picture now. We are not only giving the certain abstract recommendations to the Ministry of Healthcare, to Infrastructure, but we are in a constant dialogue with those institutions, and they understand the need to cooperate with the Anti-Monopoly Committee. But there is a positive tendency, but to say that I'm totally satisfied with the quality of response from the ministries and institutions, I cannot tell that. And we have a fundamental issue left, and Mr. Alexander paid attention to that. I'm emphasizing this problem constantly. If we open our main law, well, I don't mean the Constitution, but the law on the protection of economic competition. Article 4 says that the development of the competition, the development of demonopolization programs, the constant monitoring of the competitive environment on the correspondent markets must be held by the state authorities and local self-government. When we hear the rhetoric, which we can hear at the certain authorities meetings, anti-monopoly committees that, anti-monopoly committees this, so in fact, during a very long period of time, the ministries and institutions didn't have the understanding that for the development of the competitive environment is their responsibility. They are responsible to understand who the main players are, what the economic problematics of their activities is, and in case of certain problematic signals, they should inform the Anti-Monopoly Committee for us to hold the high-quality investigation and investigate it for not of 3 years, but for half a year. And it was a totally different rules of the games, different quality of cooperation, and different speed of reaction from us. The improvement, well, we don't like the word improvement, but it's still taking place, and lots of time should be wasted for us to achieve the real separation, the separation of the work of ours and other institutions. It will take several years, I guess, so we are facing rather funny practical issues. When, for instance, we sent to a certain ministry, I will not name it, the letter emphasizing the necessity to have the certain instrument of the sharing of information according to the Article 4, and to hold the certain monitoring of the markets, which have a very substantial significance, and we got the response. Yes, we have the law, but the provisions about our ministry does not foresee the constant monitoring of the state of competition at the markets. Honestly speaking, it's kindergarten. So, you know, in English they say there is the push situation and the pull situation. When you have to push someone and you have to pull someone. So, when the situation when you pull someone is more constructive, I would say, because we want, for this second sphere of relationship, as for the construction of the agenda of the work with the interaction with the institutions and high quality relationship. This is a very energy costly work. I personally pay lots of attention to that, and I claim from my colleagues who are working with me, I guess both Oksana and Igor will agree with me, like the heads of the certain departments, they can remember how many times I told them about the necessity to construct a high-quality cooperation with the institutions. We've got the changes. I cannot say that the administration of the seaports or Ukrainian railways have the people who do not wish to cooperate. That's not right. I cannot tell that. When we begin to communicate with them, they understand that your task is not to stab them in the back and to have fines for millions or hundreds of thousands, but to develop solutions together. This understanding is coming gradually, and the wish to work is coming. In our case, it took 1.5 years. The third block, I told you, the first concentration, the second one is relationship with the institutions, the third block is the use of law. And unfortunately, the use of law is the less efficient, the least efficient sphere where the solutions of the committee are implemented, unfortunately. So, first of all, considering that in our activities we have certain restrictions as for the proof base we can work with, the evidence base, and the certain low-quality information infrastructure, our investigation mostly take place longer than we would like it to be, but shorter than in the European Union. Because as for the Google, they investigated it for 7 years, and our investigation took 1.5 years. But if we speak about the real implementation of decisions, I mean through fines paid or the real stop of abuse of rights, the discipline begins to increase. But as of 2015, the payment indicator was 5%, the fine indicator was 5%. Of course, we were not satisfied with that. But the fines is not our main task. As for the indicator, the real fines into the profit of the state budget, this is the wish of the subject to perceive those decisions. Not to obey, but to perceive them. We're working upon these problematics. There are certain suggestions which are now included in 2 law drafts as for the increase of the technical efficiency of the implementation of decisions of Antimonopoly Committee, but I think that not a single country in the world can tell that everything is perfect, we achieved the perfect situation. We will always work upon that, but honestly speaking, in the certain directions we have certain accomplishment, in certain ones we have more problems than results. Thank you, dear colleagues. Any other questions left, please? Sergiy Chesham. Dear colleagues, good afternoon again. Look, during your speech, Yuriy Terentyev, you've raised a very interesting and complicated issue of concentration at the markets of agrarian products and the enterprises. So you've mentioned that during these concentrations you're analyzing what's the amount of lands will be concentrated in one hands. So you have this information, and I totally agree with you that during the concentration you analyze how this land can have the products grown, so the turnover of the products, not the land. But as we'll have the land market soon, the control issue is very relevant, not to have certain concentrations of a big amount of lands in one hands. Do you see the role of Antimonopoly Committee in this process? Mr. Sergiy, thank you for the question. I think that the role of Antimonopoly Committee is undoubtedly should be present, but the issue is the following. In each additional authority, there can be both advantages and weaknesses. All of you know about the state procurement process, which can be both the good thing And, honestly speaking, the weakness. We have certain authorities, but we are the object of the certain attention, or the state help and support. We are performing the certain function, but simultaneously there can be certain signals that Antimonopoly committee blocks certain schemes, and there is the risk that the local communities can sometimes ask where are our undistributed 50 or 100 million hryvnia. The same is here. The land is a very peculiar resource. I think everybody agrees with that. And to say that the land can overcome monopolization, we need intellectual processing of that. If we listen to the words of Mr. Tsivkach, the goods limits of the markets, the replacement of the goods, there are certain lands and soils. But if we look at the monopolization and land, to take those two key notions and compare them, in fact, we don't have the ready model, because we can very deepen into the technology and to look at the certain type of the soil which is used only for a certain type of wheat, and the certain part of the black earth, I mean humus, can be used only by some people. This is a very complicated analysis to make such conclusions, and I think that mostly, and you faced it, both as a private lawyer and as a state-authorized person, when there is the concentration in the bigger agrarian holdings, which constantly deal with the production of wheat, for instance. Working with wheat, I'd say. Then, of course, when you're the player of an international market of wheat, you cannot just go to the sunflower. You have certain long-term contracts, and you are present at a certain market. For you, land is the way to produce this culture. As for the smaller enterprises, several thousands of hectares or tens of thousands of hectares, they can be transferred from one culture to another, and they can look that they have 2% of corn market, and next year it can be 3% of the market of wheat. Well, of course, I'm simplifying. The technical experts can argue with me, and they can say that this is a non-professional example, but still, this is obvious when we have the consequence of these analysis. So, to have the issue of the whole turnover of land only in the competency of Antimonopoly Committee would not be the most efficient way, because it may be fair, but for the practical reality and that chaos of land market, it can be problematic in the real use, because it needs a very long technical, deep, understanding of the agrarian industry. I do remember that in the end of 2015 we gave certain suggestions as for the law drafts, as for the land market, and it contained a simplified model, that there were certain restrictions as for the number of hectares you can own or you can rent, and the Antimonopoly Committee can follow the process. Of course, it's a very primitive approach. We're looking at that not from the point of view of monopolization, but from the point of view of the arithmetical sum of the hectares you're owning. The ready model, which can be considered perfect, it does not exist. Because I think that the formation of the primary market must have certain restrictions. They have to be both arithmetic, and gradually they can be so-called relaxed. In a certain period of time, they can be easier for this market to be free. So, we take part in the legislation work, but in the end, this is a combined model, I think. Thank you. Thank you. Are there any other questions left? Thank you so much for cooperation for the participant, Mr. Terentyev, and to all of the participants. We've got the break of 15 minutes. At 18 minutes past 4, we are going on with our work. We have a very interesting speeches and markets.